There is a technique so simple and so powerful and so completely counterintuitive to every instinct that live television produces in the people who appear on it that most performers spend their entire careers working around it rather than through it, spending enormous amounts of energy and craft and professional skill developing elaborate alternatives to the one thing that would have worked better than all of those alternatives combined. The technique is silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, not the silence of confusion or hesitation or the specific blankness that comes from being caught without a response. The silence of someone who has everything to say and has chosen not to say it yet, who has understood that the space before the words is as much a part of the communication as the words themselves, who has learned through years of practice and failure and the specific education that only live television provides that the room does not need to be filled with noise in order for something to be communicated. That sometimes the most complete and most powerful communication available is the communication that arrives in the absence of words, in the pause, in the look, in the specific quality of attention that a person brings to the moment before they speak that tells the person they are looking at and everyone watching everything they need to know before a single syllable has been produced. Johnny Carson mastered this technique over 30 years of nightly live television and deployed it with a consistency and a precision that made it the most reliable tool in his considerable arsenal, the one he reached for when everything else was insufficient, the one that never failed him because it was built from the most durable material available to a performer, which is not craft or skill or experience but simply the fundamental security of someone who does not need the noise because they are not afraid of the quiet. Robert De Niro never learned it. And the absence of that learning is visible in every live television appearance he has made in the last decade in a way that is impossible to ignore once you know what you are looking at, and that tells you something specific and important about the distance between the kind of power that lasts and the kind that does not. To understand why the technique worked as well as it worked for as long as it worked, you have to understand the specific and extraordinary pressure that live television places on the people who appear on it, the pressure that produces in almost everyone who faces a live camera the specific and almost irresistible instinct to fill. To fill the silence. To fill the space. To fill the pause between the question and the answer and the next question and every gap that opens in the conversation with something, with anything, with words that may not be exactly the right words but that are at least words, at least the sound of a human being engaging with the situation rather than sitting in silence in front of a camera, in front of an audience, in front of millions of people at home who are watching and who might interpret the silence as incompetence or confusion or the specific vulnerability of someone who does not know what to say. The instinct to fill is not a weakness. It is a survival instinct. It is the response that the human nervous system has developed to the specific situation of being watched and evaluated in real time without the ability to revise or correct or take back what has been said, a situation that our nervous systems did not evolve to handle, and that produces in the bodies of the people experiencing it a kind of urgency that the body interprets as danger and responds to accordingly, by doing something, by making noise, by filling the space with evidence of engagement. Because the silence feels like exposure and the noise feels like protection even when the noise is making things worse rather than better. Carson felt this pressure. He was not immune to it simply because he was exceptionally good at managing it. He felt it in the early years in ways that were visible on the recordings from that period, in the slightly faster pace and the slightly more frequent jokes and the slightly more active quality of his engagement with guests before he had fully developed the specific confidence that the later years of the show displayed. He felt it every night for 30 years, the specific pressure of the live format, the knowledge that whatever happened in the next 90 minutes was happening permanently, that the take that did not work would remain on the record because the live format does not offer the mercy of the deleted take or the re-recorded segment or the editorial correction. He felt it and he worked with it and he developed through years of navigating it the specific skill of converting the pressure into something useful rather than something damaging, of using the urgency of the live format as a source of aliveness rather than as a source of anxiety, of being more present because of the pressure rather than more frantic. But the technique that he developed that was most distinctive and most powerful and that separated him most clearly from everyone else who has ever sat in the host's chair was the technique of the silence, and understanding how he developed it and why it worked the way it worked requires understanding the specific problem that the silence was developed to solve. The problem was difficult guests. Not difficult in the sense of unpleasant or hostile or unwilling to engage, though the Tonight Show had its share of those and Carson handled them with his own specific approach. Difficult in the sense of guests who arrived at the desk carrying something too large for the format, something that exceeded the available space in the conversation, something that was going to overflow the banks of the interview regardless of what Carson did to contain it unless he found the right tool for the specific problem the guest presented. These were the guests who had strong convictions and the need to express them at length and the specific quality of certainty that can make a person impervious to the usual redirections that a host employs when a conversation is going somewhere the host does not want it to go. These were the guests who could hear a redirect and absorb it and continue in the original direction as if the redirect had not been attempted, who could feel the energy of the room shifting away from what they were saying and interpret that shift not as a signal that they should change course but as confirmation that what they were saying was important enough to continue regardless of whether the room was following. These were the guests who, in the live format that Carson navigated every night, represented the specific challenge of how to handle something that was going wrong without making it visibly go worse, how to correct a problem without creating a larger problem in the correction. The conventional tools were inadequate to this specific challenge. The redirect was the first tool and the most commonly used tool and the tool that worked with most guests in most situations, the simple act of asking a question or making a comment that pointed the conversation in a different direction and that most guests, reading the signal correctly, followed. But the difficult guests did not follow the redirect. They heard it and continued. The redirect was not sufficient for them because their investment in what they were saying was greater than their investment in following the host's lead, and that greater investment made them impervious to the gentle pressure of the redirect in a way that left the host with the choice of either escalating the pressure or abandoning the attempt and letting the conversation go where the guest was determined to take it. Escalating the pressure created its own problems because escalation on live television is visible to the audience and visible escalation between host and guest creates a quality of tension in the room that most audiences find uncomfortable rather than entertaining, that makes the show feel like a confrontation rather than a conversation, that changes the energy of the room in ways that are difficult to recover from and that leave everyone involved feeling like something went wrong even if the specific something that went wrong is difficult to identify precisely. Carson found the third option. The option that was not the redirect and was not the escalation but something else entirely, something that worked on a completely different principle than either of those approaches and that produced results that neither of those approaches could produce. The silence. The specific, deliberate, completely controlled silence of someone who has just heard something and has chosen to respond to it with nothing at all, to let it sit in the room without comment, to allow the thing that has been said to occupy the space without the cushioning of a response, to let the audience and the guest hear what has been said in the specific way that you can only hear something when nothing follows it, when there is no new noise to move your attention to, when the last thing that was said remains the last thing that was said for long enough to be felt as well as heard. This silence was not the silence of someone who did not know what to say. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly what they were not going to say and had made the specific choice to not say it, to let the not saying do the work that the saying could not do as well. It was the most controlled thing Carson did and therefore in some ways the most impressive thing Carson did because control at that level, the control that allows you to choose silence in the specific moment when every instinct and every pressure and every impulse of the live format is telling you to fill the space, requires a quality of fundamental security that cannot be faked and cannot be performed and cannot be achieved through technique alone but only through the specific combination of experience and self-knowledge and the deep acceptance of who you are that makes the silence feel like strength rather than vulnerability. The way it worked on the difficult guests was something that anyone who watched the show long enough could observe and describe but that required some thought to fully understand because the mechanism was not immediately visible. What happened was this. The guest said the thing, the too large thing, the thing that exceeded the space of the conversation, the thing that was going to overflow the banks of the interview. And Carson did not respond. Not immediately. Not with the warmth that usually cushioned his transitions between segments of a conversation, not with the question that would redirect, not with the comment that would signal that the conversation was moving somewhere else. He looked at the guest. He let the silence grow. And in the silence something happened to the thing that had been said, something that never happened when a response immediately followed the saying of it. The thing had to exist in the silence without support. Without the structure of a conversation to hold it up, without the next comment or the next question to give it context, without the warmth of engagement to make it feel like a contribution rather than a disruption. It had to sit in the room on its own and be heard by everyone present for exactly what it was, which was sometimes very good and sometimes very bad and sometimes somewhere in between, but always exactly what it was without the cushioning of anything that came after it. And the guest, sitting across from Carson in that silence, had to sit with what they had said without the distraction of a response, had to feel the specific weight of the thing they had produced, had to experience it the way the audience was experiencing it, without protection or interpretation or the immediate context that would have told them what to make of it. And what this often produced in the guest was something that no redirect and no escalation had been able to produce, which was self-awareness, which was the specific and sometimes uncomfortable recognition of what they had actually said rather than what they had intended to say, which was the natural and inevitable recalibration that happens when a person is made to hear themselves without the noise of the response covering the specific quality of what they have produced. Carson had learned this through observation rather than instruction. Nobody taught it to him in the way that specific skills are taught. He had watched the conversations that went wrong and had noticed the pattern of what made them go wrong, which was usually the host responding too quickly to something that required more space than a quick response could provide, the host filling the silence before the silence had been allowed to do its work, the host using the conventional tools of the format in a situation that the conventional tools were not designed for. And he had understood, through this observation, that the situation required the opposite of what the format usually required, that the difficult guest required less response rather than more, that the technique that worked was not the technique of engagement but the technique of withdrawal, not the technique of filling but the technique of emptying, not the technique of noise but the technique of silence. And he had developed this understanding into the specific practice that became one of the most recognizable and most effective things he did over 30 years of nightly television, the practice of the controlled silence that told the guest and the audience everything that needed to be told without requiring a single word to tell it. The look that accompanied the silence was essential to the technique and cannot be separated from it because the silence alone, without the look, would have been ambiguous, would have been interpretable as confusion or distraction or the host being temporarily absent from the moment, which would have defeated the purpose. The look made the silence intentional. The look made it clear that what was happening was not an absence of response but a specific kind of response, a response that was choosing not to be verbal, that was communicating through its non-verbal quality rather than through words. The look was not hostile. It was not contemptuous. It was not the look of someone who disapproves of what has been said and is signaling that disapproval through expression. It was the look of someone who has heard something and is considering it, genuinely and completely considering it, giving it the full weight of their attention without immediately deciding what to do with it, sitting with it in the specific way that you sit with something that matters before you decide what it means. This quality of the look, the quality of genuine consideration rather than judgment or approval or any of the other things that looks can communicate, was the thing that made the silence work with the difficult guests rather than against them, that prevented the silence from feeling like an attack and allowed it to function instead as a mirror, as the specific and neutral reflecting surface that showed the guest what they had said rather than what they had intended to say, that required the guest to sit with the reflection rather than immediately moving past it. Carson used it on political guests with particular effectiveness. The Tonight Show was not a political show in the way that later programs became political shows, was not a forum specifically designed for the discussion of political topics in which guests arrived with prepared arguments and the host served as the facilitator of a debate. But it was a program that regularly featured guests who had strong political views and the desire to express them, guests who came to the desk intending to use the platform that Carson's audience provided for the communication of something they believed deeply and wanted other people to hear. Carson was not opposed to political discussion. He was not opposed to guests expressing their views. He was opposed to the specific thing that happened when the expression of political views exceeded the available space of the conversation and became something that the audience experienced not as engagement with important ideas but as something else, as lecture or as performance or as the specific quality of someone using the format for a purpose that the format was not designed for and that the audience had not come to receive. And when this happened, when a guest crossed from expression into something larger and louder and less contained than expression, Carson would deploy the silence. He would let the thing sit. He would look. He would give the moment the specific weight of his attention without filling it with anything. And the guest would feel the silence and something would happen, sometimes immediately and sometimes after a beat, that was the thing the silence was designed to produce, which was a recalibration, a return to the specific register that the conversation required, a recognition in the guest that what they had been doing had taken them somewhere that the format could not support and that the format was asking them, through the most eloquent possible nonverbal means, to come back. Not every guest responded to the silence in the same way. Some guests felt it and recalibrated immediately, recognizing the signal for what it was and adjusting without requiring further intervention. Some guests felt it and paused, and the pause itself was a kind of recalibration, a moment of genuine consideration that changed the quality of what came next, even if what came next was a continuation of what had been said before. And some guests did not feel it at all, or felt it and chose to continue regardless, who were committed enough to what they were saying that the silence did not slow them down, who were in the grip of something that exceeded the available tools for managing it and that required Carson to move from the silence to something more direct, though even his more direct interventions had a quality of economy and restraint that most people's direct interventions do not have. That said what needed to be said with the minimum number of words required to say it and then stopped, because Carson had learned that the minimum was almost always enough and the maximum was almost always too much. Robert De Niro on live television is the specific case study in what happens when none of this is available, when the person in front of the camera has not developed the technique of the silence and does not have the specific quality of fundamental security that the technique requires and cannot be faked without, and has instead developed the opposite approach, the approach of filling, of volume, of the visible and audible expression of the thing being felt without the mediation of any tool, designed to make the expression more communicable to the people receiving it. He arrives at the live camera with the same complete commitment that he brought to every role he ever played, the same willingness to be fully present in the thing, the same refusal to hold anything back, the same absolute investment in what he is doing that made the performances so extraordinary and so permanent. But the commitment that worked so completely in the controlled environment of a film set, where the director could say cut and the take could be replaced and the performance could be refined through iteration until it achieved the specific quality that the story required, does not work in the same way in the uncontrolled environment of the live camera, where there is no cut and no second take and no director and no structure except the structure that the person in front of the camera brings to the moment themselves. He fills the space. He fills it with words and with volume and with the visible emotional energy of someone who is in the grip of something they believe deeply and need to communicate and who have not found the technique that allows the thing to be communicated without the grip being visible, without the need being apparent, without the specific quality of urgency that the feeling produces coming through the words and the volume and the expression in a way that changes how the communication is received. Because urgency on live television, visible urgency, the urgency that fills the space rather than inhabiting it, the urgency that exceeds the available container of the format, communicates not the importance of the thing being said but the specific emotional state of the person saying it, and the emotional state is not what the audience came to receive and is not what changes minds or moves people or produces the effect that the person producing it is hoping to produce. It produces instead the specific discomfort of watching someone have a private experience in a public space, of witnessing something that was not designed to be witnessed, of being in the presence of an emotion that has exceeded its container and that is now in the room in a form that the room was not prepared to hold. Carson would have watched this. He would have watched it with the specific quality of attention that he brought to everything that happened in his studio, the complete and immediate and non-judgmental attention of someone for whom the most important thing in the room is always what is actually happening rather than what was supposed to happen. He would have seen the urgency and the volume and the filling of the space. He would have recognized it for what it was, which was not strength and not conviction and not the specific quality of someone who has something important to say and knows how to say it, but the specific quality of someone who has lost access to the silence, who cannot find the quiet underneath the noise, who has forgotten or never learned or has temporarily misplaced the understanding that the most powerful thing you can do in any room is to be completely present in it without requiring the room to accommodate the full volume of your emotional state. He would have seen this. And then he would have deployed the technique. He would have let the silence grow in the room, let it occupy the space that the noise had been filling, let it sit there in its complete and eloquent and completely non-verbal form until the thing that had been said had to exist in it without support, had to be heard by the guest and the audience and everyone watching at home for exactly what it was. And the silence would have done what Carson's silences always did, which was to show the person in front of it their own reflection with a clarity and a completeness that no words could have achieved and no argument could have produced, and to do it with the specific kindness that comes not from protection or accommodation but from honest and direct engagement with what is actually happening, from the refusal to pretend that the thing is other than what it is. From the specific respect of treating the person in front of you as someone who can handle the truth if it is delivered in the right form, which is not the form of attack or condemnation but the form of the silence that reflects and the look that holds the reflection until the person in the reflection has seen themselves clearly enough to know what they are looking at. The most important thing that Johnny Carson understood about difficult guests, the understanding that made the silence possible and that made it work and that made it the most effective tool he ever developed for the specific problem of the live format and the person who exceeded its space, was not a technical understanding. It was a human one. He understood that the guest who fills the space with too much is almost always doing so not from confidence but from its absence, not from the security of someone who knows that what they have to say is worth saying and that the form in which they say it will communicate it effectively, but from the insecurity of someone who is not quite sure that what they have to say is getting through, who is adding volume because they are afraid the volume is not enough, who is adding words because they are afraid the words are not landing, who is filling the silence because the silence feels like evidence that something has gone wrong rather than evidence that something is working. The difficult guest is almost always a person who is afraid of the silence, who has interpreted the silence as failure rather than as the space in which what they have said can be fully heard, who has filled the space with noise because the noise at least gives them something to monitor, some evidence that they are still present and still engaging and still in the conversation even if the conversation is no longer working the way they intended it to work. Carson understood this, and the understanding made the silence compassionate as well as effective, made it something other than a weapon or a technique or a professional maneuver, made it something closer to a gift, the gift of the space in which the guest could hear themselves, could feel the weight of what they had produced, could experience the specific and clarifying discomfort of sitting with something in the quiet without the noise of a response covering over the specific quality of what the thing actually was. The silence gave the guest the chance to recalibrate. It gave the guest the chance to hear themselves the way the audience was hearing them and to make the specific adjustment that hearing yourself clearly makes possible, the adjustment from what you think you are communicating to what you are actually communicating, from the version of the thing that exists in your head to the version of the thing that has arrived in the room. Not every guest took the chance. Not every guest was capable of hearing what the silence offered. But the silence offered it regardless, consistently, without judgment, with the specific compassion of someone who believes that people are capable of better than their worst moments if they're given the right conditions and the right space and the right quality of honest attention from the person across from them. Robert De Niro never learned this not because he lacked the intelligence or the sensitivity or the human capacity to learn it but because the specific school in which he spent 50 years did not teach it and the specific gifts he brought to that school were not the gifts that the technique requires. The technique requires comfort with stillness. De Niro's gifts required the opposite, required the willingness to be completely in motion, completely transformed, completely present in the character rather than in himself, the specific kind of courage that allows you to disappear into something else entirely and to trust that the disappearance will produce something truer than the presence could have produced. These are different skills. They are both extraordinary skills. They are not the same skill and they do not develop together and they do not transfer from one context to the other in the way that some skills transfer. The silence that Carson used was the product of being completely himself on camera for 30 years. The performances that De Niro produced were the product of being completely someone else on camera for 50 years. The first produces comfort with stillness and comfort with the self and the specific security of someone who has spent enough time in their own company to know who they are without the character to tell them. The second produces the opposite, produces the specific discomfort of the self without the character, the specific vulnerability of the person who has spent so much time being other people that the experience of being themselves in front of a camera in front of an audience in a conversation that has no script and no director and no second take is something they have not sufficiently practiced to be comfortable with and something that their extraordinary gifts have not prepared them for. And so he fills the space. And so the noise continues. And so the thing that he wants to communicate remains partially obscured by the volume of the communication, by the visible urgency of the need to be heard, by the specific quality of someone who is afraid that the silence will reveal something they are not ready to have revealed and who fills it therefore with everything they have. with all of the passion and all of the conviction and all of the visible emotional energy of someone for whom this matters enormously and who needs the audience to know that it matters enormously, even at the cost of the specific clarity that the quiet would have allowed. And somewhere in the archive of 30 years of nightly television, in one of the thousands of hours of recordings that document the most complete portrait of a single human being on camera that American broadcast history has produced, Johnny Carson is sitting at his desk and he is looking at someone who is filling the space and he is choosing not to fill it himself, and the silence is growing and the look is doing what the look always did, and the room is responding to the silence the way rooms always respond to the silence of someone who is genuinely comfortable in it, which is to quiet itself around the silence, to let the silence be the thing, to recognize in the absence of noise the specific presence of something that is more powerful than any noise could be. That is the technique. That is the lesson. That is the thing that Robert De Niro never learned and that Greg Gutfeld, in his own way and in his own context, understood well enough to use. And that is why Johnny Carson would have silenced Robert De Niro without saying a word. Because the word was never the point. The silence was always the point. The silence was always enough.